Will you pray with me? Lord, now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, you who are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Throughout these last several months, as we have dealt with the pandemic and the abrupt shutdown of global economies, as natural disasters, windstorms, hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, and wildfires have ravaged nearly every corner of the planet, as swarms of killer hornets and locusts and frogs have invaded, causing fear and destruction, and as the virus itself has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, I have often wondered which of the biblical plagues that befell Egypt will be next. And that makes me wonder what the citizenry of Egypt, not the people in the palace, but regular folk, what were they thinking and doing throughout all of these plagues? Were they supportive of Pharaoh's hard line? Did they feel any empathy with the plight of the Israelites? Had any protested Pharaoh's earlier order to kill all of the male Hebrew babies? And then, as if by divine providence, this landed in my Facebook feed, proving once again I never really know where a sermon is headed until it happens. I don't know who wrote it, but it was shared by a page called Mormon Monastery. I support the goals of Moses and I support the goals of Moses and #let my people go, but I'm disappointed to see what used to be peaceful protests take such a violent turn. Politely asking Pharaoh to free the Israelites from slavery is much more effective than unleashing plague after plague on Egypt. And now I hear that a lot of these Israelites are out destroying their own communities by tagging their houses with some kind of gang sign. A gang sign that's painted in animal blood. What does that even accomplish? I agree that a whole people being in bondage and having their babies killed is kind of messed up, but it's still never okay to destroy other people's property with hail and locusts. They need to show more respect to the people who've been systematically slaughtering them. Violence never solved anything. 2 wrongs never make a right. Yes, violence never solved anything, and 2 wrongs never make a right. And yet, these are clearly texts of horror. The liberation of Israel is tied to the destruction of Egypt. How are we to conceive of and relate to a God who hardens the heart of Pharaoh, bringing destruction and death to countless innocent lives? How are we to relate to a movement that succeeds as a direct result of such bloodshed? On June 7th, in the wake of the murder by police of George Floyd, I did something I've never done before. I delivered a sermon specifically to the white church about the sin of racism and our complicity with systems of oppression and white supremacy that injure the lives of our Black and brown, Indigenous and non-white sisters and brothers. I said that Black lives mattered to God, and that if we wanted to live true to our professed faith, that we, the white church, needed to take seriously the overwhelming evidence of racial disparities in our communities and make the necessary changes that demonstrate that indeed Black lives mattered to us as well. When I spoke those words, there was tremendous public support of the Black Lives Matter movement. A Marquette University Law School poll in mid-June showed white Wisconsin residents supporting Black Lives Matter movement by a 59 to 38% margin. But by mid-August, that 21 points in favor margin of support had fallen precipitously to 6 points against, 45 to 51. A black friend on Facebook asked earnestly, why are white Wisconsinites turning away from the Black Lives Matter movement? And what do white Wisconsinites need to stay invested in this movement for racial justice? Like Pharaoh, has God hardened the hearts of white Wisconsinites? Was it Pharaoh's free will, ego, and self-interest that held him back from acting with compassion? Is it ours? What do we make of a God who has allowed a 400-year system of injustice to remain? Why is lasting racial justice so elusive? The connection between liberation and violence in the Bible is ambiguous and unsettling. Perhaps that is because the Bible is a text that is concerned with real-life struggles of this world, that living a life of faith and acting in love is not without struggle, bitter herbs, and sacrifice. Perhaps what we can take from this text today is that the struggle for freedom and liberation is not a one-time thing. What we have come to know as the Passover was but a first step on a journey towards liberation. It marks a beginning, not an ending. Liberation is communal, not individual. The whole people go. Men, women, young, old, able-bodied, infirm, even the animals. No one is left behind. It is often overlooked but significant that time itself is being renewed. And verse 12, this month will be the first month of the year for you, says God. Every aspect of their lives is being rewritten, starting now. The offer of freedom is enticing, but it is not a sure thing. It will prove to be disruptive, frustrating, anything but simple or easy. Liberation is active. It is participatory. It isn't something that is done to the Israelites or for the Israelites. It is something they prepare for. They are full participants in it. The blood on the doorpost is a sign for the people. God knows where God's people reside, but the people need to claim their identity. The blood on the doorpost is a declaration. I am a Hebrew. I will sacrifice for the liberation of God's people. The blood on the doorpost marks the beginning of a transformation, both physically and spiritually, from slavery to freedom. Without the blood, there is no movement. I do not condone violence. Jesus gave his life to refute the lie of redemptive violence. And yet, the world we live in is not perfect. Frederick Douglass declared that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The riot is the voice of the unheard." I strongly suspect that the precipitous drop in white Wisconsinite support for Black Lives Matter is directly a result of rioting that has turned violent, and the discomfort, anxiety, and outright fear that brings to white America. We want peaceful change, change that is not disruptive, messy, or yes, violent. What we forget is that violence is always already present. Have we forgotten the fire hoses and police dogs, the lynchings and assassinations that marked the civil rights movement of the 60s? Systems of domination and oppression have existed since there have been people living together. Chattel slavery may have been outlawed, but state-on citizen violence is a fact of life, as is the escalation of violence during protests if the stakes are high enough. an armed militia, unofficially working in concert with state power, even if it looks like a 17-year-old kid, represents a serious escalation and threat to the lives of citizens. It is a serious indication that, yes, the stakes are truly high enough. If the response of white Wisconsinites to escalating civil unrest is simply that rioters are bad, then we are not on the side of freedom, peace, and lasting change. Violence, police violence, housing violence, educational violence, healthcare violence, mass incarceration violence, wage violence against black and brown bodies is a fact of life. Sadly, what the poll tells us is that white Wisconsinites are stating a preference for who violence happens to. What is God asking from the church in this moment? What are we prepared to sacrifice for freedom? Gird your loins, strap on your sandals, grab your staff. This is just the beginning. Amen.